Welcome back. In this segment, we will be covering the cognitive theories of development, and we're going to start with Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. We're going to be seeing this theory throughout the lifespan up to and including the emerging adulthood period, and so it's a really important theory to understand. This is the time I'm going to introduce you to an aspect of the theory that doesn't really, it's sort of taken as known throughout the rest of the discussion throughout the quarter, so I want to make sure I emphasize it right now. Basically, Piaget believes that at all ages that we're seeking to understand our world, that our cognitions are directing us to collect information and compare it to what we already know so that we can make sure that our representation of the world is as accurate as possible. He introduced the concept of scheme. You might have heard it referred to as a schema. You might hear it pluralized as either schemes or schemata. All of that's really the same thing. What we're talking about with the concept of scheme is that you have a mental framework in your mind that helps you to organize information. I thought it would be fun to give you an example based on childhood kind of language, because when children are little and they don't know very many words yet, you can see in action what their framework of understanding must be. So let's pretend like we have a little kid who knows the name for the dog and knows the name for the cat, right? So they correctly call dogs dogs and they correctly call cats cats. All right, so as far as everything's going, this child is displaying equilibrium. The words that they know for things, their presumably mental framework for how things are organized seems to be accurate. If it's small, it's furry, it meows, has a long tail, it's probably a cat. And if it's bigger and furry and it barks, it's probably a dog, right? Now that's a really rough categorization, right? Because some cats are bigger than some dogs, right? But these are like rough categorizations that are probably present, but how would we know? How would we know that that's the equilibrium that the schema that this child has for different animals is organized the way that I just described? Well, a lot of times when you introduce a child to a new animal, let's say a cow, you can tell how they must have their information stored by how they mislabel that cow. They don't know the word for cow yet, so they call it a dog. That really underscores the idea that they, in general, are thinking dogs are bigger than cats. This animal is bigger than a cat, so they're going to say it must be a dog. They think they've got equilibrium, that they're correctly representing the world, but then here comes the adult who says, no, that's not a dog, that's a cow. So with many repetitions of this poor child being confused, wait, what are you talking about? Nope, that's a cow, that's not a dog. We call those cows. Cows moo. Cows live out on the farm. Cows give milk, right? And adults give all these pieces of information to help distinguish dogs and cows, right? But the child's trying to figure it out, completely confused and experiencing disequilibrium, until they finally figure out what the new categorization is. Ultimately, they start to realize, okay, I keep hearing that every time I call that a dog, I'm wrong. I've got to figure this out and sort it out differently. Once they finally do that and start calling the cow a cow, the disequilibrium leaves and they actually are now experiencing equilibrium. They are back to representing the world as it is. So they've got correct labels for the correct animals. The fact that most children make these kinds of errors where they overextend known words to new things shows us a little bit about how they organize information in their minds. Probably we have information organized very similarly. It's just a little harder to tell with adults how things are organized than it is with children, because children are learning the names for things. And there are times when we have adults learning things and we can see that they must organize information in certain ways also. So we think that this is true across the lifespan, that we have schemas, that we are striving for a match between the schema in our head and then the world as it is. And anytime we start to realize that our schema isn't accurate, we'll start to experience that uncomfortable period of disequilibrium where things just aren't making sense. Just to make it fun, now this kid learns that there's another animal standing out at the farm. And now that they've learned that a cow is called a cow, it would not be surprising to expect them to call a horse a cow. It's standing out in the field. It's at the farm. It's big. It's four-legged. I guess it's a cow. I mean, it's clearly got some stuff missing that the cow has, but I mean, it's closer to a cow than the other things I know. And so when they misrepresent the horse as a cow, it's evidence that, again, they're trying to apply the schema as it exists. And it isn't until the adult comes back and says, okay, that's not a cow, that's a horse. Horsies say neigh. You can ride a horse, right? Look at the horsie's tail compared to the cow's tail. Look at the mane, right? Really attract the attention to how the cow and the horse differ, that then the child will ultimately change their schema to represent horse. And then you can imagine if they saw a sheep, right? Now maybe their rubric of size is still in place. And so they're like, well, it's not as big as a cow. It's bigger than a cat. I guess it's a dog, right? So you can kind of see how children's schemas are structured based on how they misapply labels to things that are similar but not the same in their schemas. So this concept of schema is going to be with us just sort of as an implicit part of Piaget's theory. As we go through each stage of development, we'll go through all of Piaget's theory in great detail. So I'm not going to bog down on that right now. I just wanted to introduce this concept of scheme and keep it in the back of your mind throughout. Another theory that we're going to be talking about that's a cognitive theory is Kohlbergs' moral ladder. He was a follower of Piaget, so he had the same kind of idea of how cognitions get more sophisticated and develop over the lifespan. There are three main levels of Kohlberg's moral ladder, and then having super bad tongue tie. Three main levels, and within each level, 2 stages. So we're going to talk about these as we go through and see that, as the child develops cognitively, they are going to start to move up the ladder. I'll just foreshadow, though, that even though you're moving up the ladder doesn't mean that you don't display some decision making that is appropriate to an earlier level. By the way, the word moral here doesn't have anything to do with religion or faith or something like that. It's about how a person decides whether a behavior is right or wrong, whether it's a good behavior or bad behavior. And so when we are thinking in a pre-conventional way, we're really concerned about avoiding punishment or securing some kind of reward. When we're conventional level, we're very concerned about what other people think about us and then what the rules and the laws really are. And then when we get to the post-conventional level, we're very concerned about maintaining the social contract, the idea that we've all agreed to live in a certain way as a society and stuff like that, as far as like following the speed limit and these kinds of things. So social contract would be the moral justification for our decisions, or more like universal ethical principles, that it would be wrong to behave in this way. It would be right to behave in that way. It's also important as an overall characterization to mention that a person who's making post-conventional decisions is not necessarily going to do a behavior that is objectively right. It is for them what they feel is the right thing to do, but other people might disagree. But they're less concerned about what other people think because they're in the post-conventional level. If they were concerned about what people think, they'd be at the conventional level. So when we go through the different age brackets, we'll talk about which of these stages or these levels of moral reasoning is appropriate for each of the stages. So we'll be seeing this later. In general, there is a cognitive theory called information processing theory. There's a bunch of different little segments of information processing theory that are represented by different theories. I just thought I would characterize in general what information processing theories say. One thing that they say is that the way that we think is very similar to how machines think, how computers, your phone, stuff like that, as far as parallel processing and storing of information and collecting of information, like it's very similar to how computers work, they say. They also point out that with greater experience comes greater automation. And this is going to be a theme in your textbook, that as kids age, you're going to see that they get better at motor skills, that they get better at using their memories, that all together they're getting better. And what we mean by better is they get faster and they get more efficient. It takes less of their attention. It takes fewer resources to accomplish tasks. And that's really predicted by information processing theories, that as we get experience, we can actually move what had been a challenging task over into an automated task. And I'll just give you a great example from your own lives. If you know how to drive or you know how to ride a bike, this will make a lot of sense. That when you first were learning either of those things, it was really complex, and there's so much to worry about and all the things to think about, and it just seemed like you would never be able to like drive your car and listen to the radio, or ride your bike no-handed, or like it just seemed it's so much. I can barely keep the bike up, or I can barely keep the car in gear. But with experience, now you can drive your car and eat. You can, ride your bike and eat. I've seen people riding their bikes and texting. I mean, because you've gotten a lot of experience with it, you can kind of let that part take care of itself, the driving or the riding, and you can put your attention on something else. And that's what we see with development, is that more and more behaviors become automated, and that allows us to put our attention on the more challenging things that we don't have as much experience with. The last thing I want to finish up with is just a little bit of an overview of the cultural contextual theories. One of them you'll see repeatedly throughout the textbook. The other one, for some reason, they don't talk about anymore, but I thought you still deserve to see it. So the first one is Vygotsky's socio-historical theory, and this is the one that the textbook talks about a lot, and you'll see it popping up in my lectures later and things. Vygotsky argues that you've got the child at the middle, and he's or she is surrounded by the microsystems of the home, the religious settings, the school, the neighborhood. But the microsystem is only made up of those aspects that directly interact with the child, that the child has direct contact with and continuous contact. Like, you don't have to see it necessarily every day, but really consistent, so that the child feels like this is an active influence on my life. The next layer, the mesosystem, would be the parts of those same things that maybe are working with each other in a way that doesn't directly influence the child, or doesn't the child doesn't see it happening. So for example, in the home, all those decisions that mom and dad make that they don't confer with the child or explain to the child, but these are decisions that now are having an impact on the child. At school, there are things going on that contribute to the culture of the school that aren't directly impacting the child, but have an influence on the child. Those are all things that are part of the mesosystem. And then the outer ring is called the macrosystem. It's cut off in my picture, but that would be all the things that are around the child that have, an impact on the local culture of the child, but, don't directly impact the child. So you've got like mass media. So it may be coming to the child, but the child has no influence on it, like that kind of thing. It's really important to notice that within the microsystem, you see arrows that are going both ways. So you see the child influences the parent influences the child, and so on. In the mesosystem, you see that home is influencing religion and religion is influencing home, but you don't see any arrows going into the microsystem on that. So when Vygotsky talks about these different levels, he's really talking about sort of independent levels that aren't necessarily you do see some arrows going between the mesosystem and the macro system. You do see arrows going at that level, but no arrows going into the microsystem from either of those, which is different from Bronfenbrenner. That's why I was bringing it to your attention, right? Because Bronfenbrenner, you're going to say, oh, I can see why they took it out of the textbook. It looks like identical. It really does look very similar. Still have the child at the center. And then their direct peers. So that could be the siblings and it could be their friends, right? Then you have surrounding that the family system. Then surrounding that would be the school system. And then around that would be the community system. So first off, this, what Vygotsky would call microsystem components are actually each individual rings in Bronfenbrenner's model. The other thing that you'll notice is for Bronfenbrenner, you've got the individual influencing the family in the same way that the family is influencing the individual, right? Like those are double-headed arrows. So the influence flows both directions. So a lot of times when we are younger and we haven't had kids yet, so some of you who maybe have kids and are listening, you can verify what I'm talking about here. When we haven't had our own children yet, a lot of times it feels like we were raised by our parents and that we were like a sponge that took on a lot of the things that they were imposing on us. And same thing with, what teachers did to us kind of things, or, like it felt like we were the sponge and everybody else had their agenda and we're just following their agenda. What Bronfenbrenner is acknowledging is what a lot of people who are parents can also confirm, which is that there's a flow back and forth. Your parents probably behaved differently with you than their plan had been, or that then maybe they did with their other kids, because you put out stuff that caused them to have to maybe adjust. And that's what Bronfenbrenner is really acknowledging, that it's not a direction flowing to the child. It's really an interaction between the child and all these different levels. But Bronfenbrenner doesn't really show up in our textbook, and it might be because, we don't have that much time in this class to cover every single detail of development. So I just thought I'd throw it in there that there is a slightly different way to look at it than Vygotsky, but we will in this class be talking about Vygotsky. All right, well, that concludes chapter 2. So I will see you next in chapter 3.